you so much for having me, y'all. Yes, my name is Chelsea Chism-Vargas, and I am going to be screen sharing. So give me just a moment here. And my name is Chelsea Chism-Vargas. My pronouns are she, her, ella in Spanish, and I'm here to talk to folks about storytelling for social change. Kind of sounds like a big topic, so let's dive in a little bit here. And I just want to say I was able to hear the last conversation, so I'm excited to be a part of this just because this is a lot of great content, so thank you for having me. So storytelling for social change. Well, kind of like why storytelling is a big part of this, right? Storytelling is super important, and it's something that we do all the time on a day-to-day basis. It's something that many of us perhaps grew up with, right? Storytelling really is tradition. Storytelling often happens for entertainment purposes, right? To get folks excited about something or to tell them a series of events. Also, though, storytelling is really utilized to transfer knowledge as well. So sometimes we'll tell each other messages via stories, either messages to protect one another or to inspire one another. But it's really, there's a lot of information in storytelling. So this is one big reason that storytelling is effective. It helps us transfer knowledge in a way that keeps people engaged and keeps people excited. But storytelling does a lot more than that too, right? If we think about some of our favorite stories, I immediately think back to like childhood stories, but they invoke emotions in us, right? Whether something was scary or something, like I mentioned, was inspiring, it causes us to have these feelings through the story. And those feelings, they don't just invoke feelings, but they then invoke values. They invoke things that we care about, things that we think are important when we hear a story. And when we're able to have these kind of community sense of values, right, this social understanding of being rooted in very similar values, that causes us to have connections with people. It really helps us realize that we're not in this alone, that other people feel how we feel from our emotions, that they're grounded in those same values, and it causes us to really create solidarity with one another. Storytelling as well, though, if you think of really any story, stories have a clear challenge, right? Something that happened or something that someone was going through. And then a choice is made, right? There's usually that moment in a story where the individual who's the main focus of the story makes a choice, right? Maybe they made a bold decision, maybe they were brave. And then outside of that choice, we see an outcome. What was a result of the challenges that they were going through and the choice they made to get us where we are? So storytelling is an amazing tool for advocacy and an amazing tool to connect with a wide audience. It's something that I personally have found super, super valuable to my work. I do sexual and reproductive health organizing, so very similar health advocacy, and being able to tell our own stories, control our own narratives when perhaps the public is saying something else, really allows us, like I mentioned, to control our narrative and get our message out there directly from us. So storytelling is an incredible tool, and we'll dive into it even more. So when we say storytelling for social change, why social change? Why do we want to create things? Why do we want to create a change socially? Well, if we can raise an awareness for something, right, via our story and get those people to feel those values, we can cause them to take action. We can really be what causes them to say, hey, you know, enough is enough, or I want to get involved. And if we can do that with enough people, we can create the social change we need. So a few points here. We need to raise an awareness on our unique healthcare experiences. This is something that's super important as we're thinking about healthcare, because all of our healthcare experiences are very individual, right? No one's story is the same. So creating an awareness about how unique our experiences are, especially in healthcare, allows people to better understand this big, huge system, which seems really intimidating and it has so many barriers. And as well as those who are most impacted, right? You should be at the center of this work. You should be the one telling your story to then create that social change. It wouldn't make sense to have someone who wasn't a type 1 diabetic to be leading on type 1 diabetic issues because they're not as familiar with the issue, right? So we want to make sure that when we're doing social change, that the ones who are leading the social change are the ones that are closest to the issues because they're the experts, right? That brings us to our next point. You are the expert and you have a keen understanding of how to address these issues. So the resolutions, the changes, they should come from those who are directly impacted. Also, it helps us support ourselves, right? It helps us create that advocacy and invites others to join in on us, but it's not just for us, right? We don't storytell just for our own self. Although we do, it's very important to be your strongest self-advocate. But we also do it for the good of others. We do it because we understand this is a social issue that although we do have that unique experiences, there are many other people with just as unique experiences, and we need to all support each other and move forward together. So that's why storytelling and social change, right? Telling your story in this public setting or thinking beyond yourself and thinking for a movement is super effective, especially when you're connecting with people's values. So when we're saying storytelling for social change, what that also means is creating a public narrative. That kind of sounds like a big title, but it's quite simple. As you see, there's a little graph here that has the self, the us, and the now. And so it kind of brings people along the way with us. So this is an important part. There's 3 parts to a public narrative. There's the story of self, right? Why you are in this work, what brings you to this movement. That's really important for just relational experiences. You know, when you open yourself up, when you make yourself vulnerable, it invites others to be in relation to you, to better understand you. So starting with the story of self really is a good grounding for people to connect with you and move into the us. So once you're starting with the story of self, it's important as you move into the us to really realize you're not in this world alone, right? We're all in this together. So the us is why we should all care about this issue, right? Why we should all care about insulin being so hard to come by sometimes. Why we should care about the fact that people need insulin, right? Just as much as they need oxygen. And that's something, again, folks can all relate to needing oxygen. So bringing it back to the us really allows us to be in this fight with you, whether they are directly impacted as you are, they don't have to be, right? Your story of self allows them to connect with you, and the us helps them realize why everyone is impacted by this issue and why we all need to move forward and care together. So then when we move into the now, right, that's helping us realize, okay, now you know why I'm impacted, now you know why this is important to you, but what are we going to do next? That's really important when we're talking about a public narrative and social change, because we always want to have a call to action, right? Let folks know that there's something that we can do about it. There's an issue and it can be fixed. So self, us, now is a big part of public narratives as we're moving towards social change. But public narratives are important because they help us understand the world, right? They help us realize how we're connected and why things are much bigger than our own individual lives. And there's often 2 popular ways in which folks understand the world. There's the head, right? When we're thinking about the head, we're thinking about data, statistics, facts. So that's why you kind of see all these, microscopes. It's very science and factual based. And this is important, right? It's important to have this component, the head component, because it allows people to really see the hard data and see just see how these structures are created. But if we also think about it, if we're thinking with just the head, if we're communicating, if we're storytelling with just data and just facts, that's not really storytelling. That is like researching, right? Or that is relaying information. However, when we're doing it with just the head, we don't feel it the same, right? And a lot of those statistics, maybe you'll hear them in that moment, but you're not going to necessarily remember them 5 minutes later even, or directly after. So the head is important, but it can't be the only thing. Another way that public narratives help us understand the world is through heart. So that's another way to put a form of expression. When we hear a very moving story, a very emotional story, we remember that, right? That's what really causes us to have those values. But if a story is too much heart, it's overwhelmingly emotional. And at times it could even cause you to not be able to connect so much to the storyteller, because perhaps you're even just concerned on how they're processing their emotions at the time. We never want to storytell when we're not ready. So think about that, as we think about how we can tell our stories for social change. Are you comfortable doing it at this moment? Because you don't have to be. You don't have to do anything that you're not ready to do. And so thinking with the heart is good, right? Because it causes us to make that emotional connection. But we don't want to get too emotional that people are just lost in emotion and not grounded in anything. So that moves us to needing both, right? We really, when we're storytelling, we need a combination of the data, and we need a combination of your individual personal experience, because combining those two is what really allows us to have an emotionally invested but mindfully grounded framework to then take action, right? If it's too much head, people aren't going to remember it. If it's too emotional, people might just be stuck with all of those emotions and not be able to take action. So here we have this cute little graphic of them both come together, lighting a light to really emphasize the ideas, right? And emphasizing how these things work together, because that's the next step, is we need to take action. So that's kind of a lot. So to even ground us even more, when you build your own story, your story should have a very clear challenge. Whatever it may be, perhaps it's having to sit on the phone, right, with your health insurance provider. Perhaps it's struggling to communicate, like someone mentioned right before, with your employer on your needs in the workplace, or as a student, right? Perhaps it's struggling even as a young student, right? We're talking type 1 diabetes, even as a child, perhaps it's not being able to have your classmates really understand your own experience and your own needs. So your challenge should be very, very clear. When someone hears your story, they should be able to identify your challenge very clearly. And then your story should always have a choice, right? What did I do next? What was that moment that caused me to act, right? That caused me to stick up, to stand up to my employer, or to really advocate for yourself on the phone with your insurance. Whatever it is, you should have a very clear choice in your story as well. And then from that choice is the outcome. What happened? What happened when a young person advocates for themselves at school? What's the reaction from their classmates? That outcome should be very clear. And that should also be how we're moving people to realize that they can take action as well, right? That choice, having people realize that when you make a choice, they can make a choice too, and that this outcome can happen together. And throughout all of that, you'll see at the bottom here, this moral line. You should be infusing throughout all of this values and morals and what's important to you, right? Advocating for yourself, like I mentioned, on the phone with your insurance, that's something a lot of people can relate to, right? So just saying like, I deserve everything that I need, can really be something that grounds folks in morals as well. So as you're building your story, those three components are something to really think about: the challenge, the choice, and the outcome. What was the challenge that you were facing? What was the choice that you made as a result? And what is the outcome after the fact? So as we're thinking about this, also continue to think about the story of self, right? Because that's really how you're going to talk about your challenge. What is it that makes your story unique? And then as we move into the story of us, right? That's kind of the choice component. What can I do? What can you do? And then when we move into the sense of now, that's when we really see the outcome. So as we're thinking about developing your story, I do storytelling trainings a lot. And usually when I start, people are like, well, I don't have a story, which is hilarious because if you're on this call today, if you're on this conference, you have a story. Something brought you here. And often it involves some very intentional and courageous introspection to think about what is my story? Where did it start? So just a few bullet points that I would love to run through and expand on are, what are the experiences in your life that have shaped your values and led you to this cause, right? So everyone has a different life experience. So everyone's story should be a little bit different. Maybe it's your racial background, right? Maybe it's your gender identity that's also included in this story. Because those are your unique experiences in your life and the values that come with that, that have led you to this cause. Often, as we just heard on the last call too, this isn't a one-issue fight for many of us, right? If you could be type 1 diabetic, but perhaps you're also in a lower socioeconomic class, right? Or whatever those different intersections are. Developing your story and thinking about all of that, and thinking about how unique your experience is because of those various identities really allows you to create your own unique story. And even if someone doesn't share those identities, they can relate, right? They can relate to your values that you're expressing through all of that. And then this point right here, when did you first care about being heard? As you're continuing in your advocacy, what was it, right? What was it that caused you to stand up for yourself? Because that's a big part of your choice in your story. What was it that you were facing that you said, not anymore, I need to act, which leads us to that lessons to learn in every single story. And so include that in your storytelling, because although maybe you think a lesson is easily understandable, communicating that thoroughly really helps ground everyone else in your story as well. What were the circumstances, the place, the colors, the sounds? This is probably my favorite part of storytelling, because I feel like this is kind of what takes us back to those classic storytelling components that we had before. But where were you, right? Where were you when you feel like you had to act? When you felt like you had to act? What was the environment like? What was the day like? Including those components in your story. Perhaps you're sitting in a doctor's office and you can talk about, what the doctor's office room smelled like, or, what the paper that you're sitting on the bed felt like. Those are things that folks can relate to. And when we're talking about those specific circumstances, right? Maybe it's how mad you were, or maybe it was, an emotion. When we include those emotions, those feelings, those sensations, right? Those 5 senses, it allows people to be in our story, not just hear our story, but it's like they're moving through our story with us. And that's a really important part of storytelling, especially when we're thinking, how do we get people to act, right? If you can get them to feel those emotions, to understand the struggle that you were going through, to really be in that room, in that space, in that moment with you, those circumstances really allow people to take action. So our next slide is avoiding the pitfalls when it comes to storytelling. This can be difficult. We want to tell the story. We want to be clear. We want to be specific. We don't want to get too much in, as much as we want to tell the details, we don't want to be confusing or get people off track. We want to be very specific with our challenge, with our choice, with our outcome. So when we have that framework, it really does allow us to be more specific. So tell the story, not about the story. Be specific, be vivid, be clear. But be ready. That is a big component to all of this. Therapy versus vulnerability. And I do see some questions coming in the chat, so we will have time to answer those too. But therapy versus vulnerability, right? This was like that heart image that we saw, which was just that exploding heart. Don't tell a story you're not ready to. You don't have to. Your story is yours to share when and if you ever want to. No one is going to force you to tell your story, and if they are, you should consider if that's a safe space for you. Therapy versus vulnerability. We don't want to share too much of that emotional space, just because it can be very overwhelming for yourself, overwhelming for the audience. But vulnerability does help, right? It does help folks to realize, like, you were scared, or you were crying, or you were emotional. And often too, when we see a public speaker that does get in touch with their emotions, and not even a public speaker, but just someone that we're interacting with, when we see someone who isn't afraid to shed a tear, that also moves us. So it's just about kind of perfecting your story to the right amount of vulnerability, which takes time to do. So don't be too hard on yourself too if you're not there yet, because your story is going to continue to change. Don't tell your whole life when you tell your story. Pick a couple really important points. As many of us have, an entire background, right? We don't need to hear all of that necessarily. There's ways that we can introduce it, but be specific with your story. Pick 2 or 3 points. Don't give us your life resume like on the next point. Keep it concise. Stick to the purpose. If you're advocating for yourself, if you're advocating for insulin access or whatever it may be, say that, right? You don't need to tell us every other detail if it doesn't necessarily help your story, help promote your story. So be short. Your story shouldn't be longer than 3 minutes. This is kind of a very traditional tip. I do think in different settings, right, your story might be a lot shorter. Your story might be a lot longer, but you should pretty much, when you're creating a story, always have a 3-minute version, kind of like a stump is what it's often called in like political spaces, right? That will just help you stick with a short amount of time, because anything after 3 minutes, people get lost, right? I know sometimes we see it too when we're just scrolling on our phone. If we see a long video, we might keep scrolling. So it's important to realize that, right, with our storytelling, what environment we're already living in, especially as we're living in this digital world. Your story should be concise, but never feel rushed. Never feel rushed to tell your story either, because you deserve all the time that you need. And stick to the structure. Stick to that challenge, choice, and outcome structure, to just allow the listener and yourself to have a very clear story. And you don't necessarily need to write your story. I mean, you know your story better than anyone else, and no one can tell you that your story is wrong. I think it's really important to remember that. You know yourself better than anyone else does. So stick to that structure. You can write it down the first time, but once you really start just realizing, this is my story, I know my story, I know what happened, that challenge, choice, outcome is going to be really effortless after a while. This is pretty much our last slide, and we'll get to the questions as well. Your story always changes, right? Because you're growing, you're going to continue to grow, but your story changes too, depending on your audience, right? Maybe you're speaking with legislators, right? Maybe you're challenging big pharma, who knows? Maybe you're telling your story on social media. Maybe it's just in a series of 5 tweets, you're talking about what you're going through, and you can use a hashtag for that, right? So you're not going to have the same story that you tell to perhaps your senator that you tell to maybe your Facebook feed, right? It's going to be different. Same thing with family. Your 3-minute story can be adjusted to seem much more natural, and it can be something that you tell your family at dinner, or whatever it may be, right? But the connection that you have with your family is also going to be very different from the storytelling type that you do with social media. Maybe you're doing it for a fundraiser, right? For a social cause. So then that story is going to be quite a bit different because you want to get people to donate. So think about that, right? If your story is changing a little bit, depending on your audience, that's going to also change how you tell your story. Maybe with talking to senators, we still need to keep that very emotional component, but maybe they want some more of those statistics. Maybe a fundraiser wants more of the statistics, but maybe your family wants to hear more about you. Telling it at a rally, right? The emotion at a rally is going to be a lot different than when you're talking to a legislator, right? The volume of your story and how you bring people along. Or maybe you're telling your story at work to advocate for yourself. And so you don't want to get as personal at work. So the way that we tell our story is going to continue to change. We're going to continue to evolve and grow and learn. Society is going to continue to change. So our stories are always going to continue to adapt as we tell them. So maybe you have one story, but it's going to have different components when you're talking to different audiences. So that is mostly the end of my slides. I do just want to promote share your story, because your story is unique and it's powerful and it can create social change. I promise you that. I have my Twitter on here if folks do want to stay connected. My DMs are open. I'm happy to communicate with folks and thankful to be on here.
Thank you so much, Chelsea.
Okay.
So here
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you really think anyone can tell their story? I'm so interested in storytelling, but I'm not sure I can be a good storyteller and really convey my emotions and experience.
Everyone is a good storyteller in so many ways. And like I said, your story is so unique. So for anyone to tell you it's not a good story, that's not for them to say. Your story is valuable just as you are valuable and unique. And Aman, I'd be happy to connect with you more too as you're thinking about, how can you convey those emotions? Because they're natural, they're really natural. So sometimes just needing someone to kind of identify them for you and pull them out is helpful. So my Twitter is at Chism-Vargas if you want to stay connected.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. And yeah, and there are so many, I'm glad you're highlighting Twitter, because there are a lot of different forums that people can use to tell their stories. Right now, we're in the middle of our digital demonstration emphasizing the importance of lowering the list price of insulin, so people have the opportunity to tell their story there. You mentioned political rallies, you mentioned, with your friends and family. I guess trying to connect to a topic from earlier today also, do you have any recommendations for allies who are talking about what brought them to the Insulin for All fight to make sure that in telling our stories, we're still centering the experiences and important perspective of people with diabetes in achieving insulin for all?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't think that's just specific to this movement, right? It's for any movement. You have to really consider, am I the best storyteller for something, right? Or should I pass the mic to someone who is more impacted? However, we do know that there are more folks without type 1 diabetes than with. So we all realize we all need to get into this fight. And we really need to frame it as a human rights issue, because I think that's what really allows us to jump into it a lot easier when we realize, insulin is just as necessary as oxygen for folks. How can you not get behind and rally? So I think it's important to realize when it is your space to share, to step in and advocate for someone else, but also when can you find someone to directly tell their story, and you can simply give them that opportunity or pass them the mic to do so. But it's not just an issue that impacts folks with type 1 diabetes. This is right. This is like an insurance issue. This is an intersectional fight itself. Like we just heard on the last call, it's not just like you're someone with type 1 diabetes. Maybe you're also Black, maybe you're also gay, whatever it is. There's so many reasons that we all should get involved in this fight. But it's just kind of seeing where is your place to do so.
Absolutely. And thank you for that, because on all of the calls today, I think we've heard about the importance of storytelling and of sharing people's perspectives, and especially from those who may be traditionally crowded out of discussions. So with the racial equity panel, with the LGBTQ plus disparities conversation. I appreciate that answer a lot. And so thank you so much for joining us today. That was really wonderful, and we appreciate you.
Thank you folks so much for having me. I'd love to stay connected and keep fighting. Hey, I'm in it with y'all.